started, I'd like to welcome everyone to I think really the final panel of WordsFest. And we're joined by the writers Kim Fahner and Frances Boyle. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that we're on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape-Pewauk, and the Chinootan nations, on lands connected with the London Township and the Sombra Treaties of 1796, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, who we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to our society. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to just introduce Frances and Kim with their bios and then turn it over to them for some readings, and then we'll talk about the two books that they're here to promote and discuss. So we'll start with Frances. Frances is a writer of fiction and poetry living in Ottawa, Ontario, on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Her most recent book, I'll hold it up, is Openwork and Limestone, her third poetry collection published by Frontenac House in October 2022. Seeking Shade, her collection of short stories from the Porcupine's Quill, was published in August 2020. Her first poetry collection, Light Carved Passages, was published by Bushak Books in 2014, and her second, The White Nest, by Quattro Books in 2019. Her novella, Tower with Fish Gotta Swim Editions, came out in June 2018. So please join me in welcoming Frances Boyle. Our second reader is Kim Fahner. Kim lives and writes in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada. She's published 2 chapbooks, You Must Imagine the Cold Here, Scrivener, and Fault Lines and Shadow Cones with Emergency Flash Mob Press, as well as 5 full books of poetry, including Braille on Water, The Narcoleptic Madonna, Some Other Sky, These Wings, and Emptying the Ocean, which she is here to talk about today. And as well as being a poet, she is a prose writer who has a novel coming out next year, correct?
Yes, yeah.
All right, so please join me in welcoming Kim Fahner. I'd now like to turn it over to you guys to read.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Erin, for that, and thank you to the thank you, Erin, very much for that, and thanks to the festival for having us both. I'll read a few poems from Openwork and Limestone, and the first one is called Tide of Limestone, which, should I stand up? Would that help, or would that throw things off for the live stream? Yeah, or come forward, yeah. Yeah, I think there's maybe a better sound up here.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to start with Tide of Limestone, which is one of the poems that sort of sets the tone for the book a bit. And it's one of a couple of poems that are inspired by Robert Macfarlane's book, Underland. Tide of Limestone. Flow of glaciers, shifting salt in the deep. We belly crawl, gaps between rocks, tunnels, caves to caverns. Passing through walls, we face the stasis, the stuck place. Dark matter filters us, flows through our invisible nets. We leave handprints, scratches, scant record. So the book sort of meanders through deep time, women's work, and family. And this is one of the family poems called Camel Hair Coat. I don't want always to write about the cleft in my heart, the blade turning, my child who for so long resented me. I believe my mother caused me damage, turned away from my need, restrained my flourishing as if she tight bound me, wrists and ankles. But so little of what I remember is solid. Her camel hair coat, fluid when she walked. It smelled of Chanel and was slippery smooth inside. She'd drape herself with the coat for her afternoons resting on the Chesterfield. It was her woven shield, a golden soft refuge against us, her clamoring children. Beneath it, for 20 minutes, she could simply shut her eyes. If mothering is the thing in my life that's pained me most, how can it also have given immeasurable lightness, tripwire delight, flying in freeze frame, the cool trickle that slakes a parched throat? What insight might I have about being a mother, about having a mother? I've written of her, raw-boned and angular when I was small, her hugs all hip bone and rib, how she shrank, a softer body as she aged, the feel of her yield in my arms, the finely creased fabric of her cheeks. Returning home from the chaos after she died, a din of arrangements half a country away, I settled myself to write on a wooden patio chair in the sun. My girl was 7, wanted to climb me, sit in my lap, but I couldn't hold her as I wrote, and I wanted to write, needed to sink into myself. So I pushed her away, let her father lead her into other games. Leave your mother be. The chasm opened. My child, unmothered, just as I'd been dismantled, unpieced, only a week before. So Kim and I did a workshop yesterday for the festival on ekphrastic poetry. So I'm going to read a little poem that was inspired by a Mary Pratt painting called Silverfish on Crimson Foil. And it's also got a nod to Gerard Manley Hopkins in here. Foil. Like Hopkins' shook foil, Mary Pratt's crimson is a madcap ricochet flare, a piercing, gills raw pink red, thin blood on vermilion, light, liquid as stream flow. I might line a sheet with shiny wrap, bake fish upon it, breaded. I still debate, is the reflective surface best, or matte side up to dim the dazzle? My fresh fillets have no gills, no eyes, no silver scales. And because I'm reading with Kim, I have to read an Ireland poem. This one speaks of a family trip that we took about 10 years ago to Newgrange, not far from Dublin, where there's a Neolithic passage tomb where the solstice light, 17 minutes, I think, on either side of the winter solstice, penetrates right back to the depths of the passage. Passage. Our knot of tourists untangles in the low-lit passage, tracing the route the sun takes each solstice dawn. We squeeze along its length, shoulders brushing stone. Reaching the chamber, see chevrons, sheaves, triple spirals faint carved on rock, charred bone bits, soot shadows. A tomb. Grave goods strewn on passage floor, ornaments and tools, beads, potsherds, flakes of flint. My family's dead are ash, scattered, no care in her tomb. Our daughter waits for us outside. Sudden claustrophobe, she couldn't carry on, fumbled out, the slabs of gray whack pressing in on her. I wish I'd had a lifeline to throw, a silken cord for her safe passage back through time.
So beautiful.
Thank you. Over to you.
When you go to Newgrange, they tell you not to touch anything, but they turn off the lights and then they flash a flashlight through the open bit, right, to show you what it would be like if you could see it. And so when they turn off the flashlight, you're in pitch darkness, and that's when I groped the walls. They said, don't touch anything, and I was like, no, I'm going to touch this. I mean, the light's off. I can totally do this. I think it's doable. Well, right, because there's got to be ancestry there, and I'm not good with ancestry. I want to steal a lot of things. I thought I would read you a couple of Sudbury or Northern Ontario poems today, because I normally do that when I go places outside of the north. I just have to find them. I'll read you this one. It's called Taking Down the Stack Copper Cliff, and it's a super stack, and so they're taking it down this year. It's not environmental, it never was, but it's sort of iconic. So people who live in Copper Cliff are a little bit upset about seeing it go from the landscape. Taking down the stack, Copper Cliff. Almost half a century here, and the first half of life was time spent with the tall stack, spitting out clouds of sulfur, tasted first on tip of tongue, then back of my throat. The nickel mines coughed up rain, coating peony and lilac leaves with thick powdered silver. Old stories, flowers pressed in a prayer book, how my dead relatives would hose off the flower garden every morning at dawn, the dew clinging stubbornly to stems and painting the backs of ladybugs. Even the earwigs mistook them for simple beetles. And then if you have been to Northern Ontario, I don't know if any of you have, you often see roadkill. So this poem is called Roadkill. One great moose, all majesty, broken and laid low at the edge of a northern highway. One man standing next to his crumpled van, shocked, his fingers working madly as if playing Gould's piano, the Goldberg variations hanging in midair, so pine and blood scented. And I'll read you a pandemic poem. This one's called How to Walk with Bees in a Pandemic. Let them swarm inside a basket, the bees that gather round. They will hum orchestral, offering accompaniment to an a cappella rendering of both sides now. Don't poke, be courteous, be kind. Speak in soft tones, so as not to either irritate or frighten off. 2, don't put on a beekeeper's hat. It's overrated. Carry them loosely bundled in a blanket, a quilt made in Bonavista that still smells of sea and icebergs on a spring day, but expect some bees will go. Only a few might stay to follow. Don't cajole, be open, be kind. Speak with whispered words. Say, it's all right now, or don't worry. Lie a bit. Tell the bees you will not miss them, even though you will. Wear them as a cape thrown around shoulders with bold abandon, with a train of pollen and gossamer wings glistening in sunlight at your heels. Sing as you go. Don't hold back. Let your throat open wide. Let the notes rise from the depths of your belly. Be the singer and the song. If the bees follow, you will hear them humming orchestral. I'll leave you with that.
Thank you both. Those are wonderful readings. I want to start with like a kind of general question, and that is, like, where did these books come from? And when did you know that you were writing books? Because like they both cover a lot of ground, right? Like Frances, you go from like Boudica to Mary Pratt. There's like several, I don't know if they're individual poems. There's a lot of Mary Pratt poems, and there's 2 Boudica poems.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like there's a lot of other stuff as well. So were you like gathering this, did you like, okay, I've got enough here, now I gather it together into a book? When did you know you were writing a book? And Kim, the same question for you.
Yeah, my usual process in all of my books so far has been to look at the poems that I've written over the course of however long it's been. In this case, of since probably 2018 till 2020, and sort of tease out themes and threads and ideas and obsessions, which I like to call motifs rather than obsessions, that are there. And here I sort of I had written, sort of a fair bit about deep time, myth, and history, but I was always also writing about family, and I want to, some of the family poems are fairly close to the bone, so I thought that sort of filtering them through deep time and through the limestone idea sort of made sense as an organizing principle, and just to give it a bit more universality, I guess. Yep. And then I also noticed that I had a lot of images of the work of women's hands generally, but sort of more specifically sort of filigree and embroidery and that kind of thing, all open work. So the contrast of putting together fabric-y stuff and handiwork with deep time and the layers and layers and layers of history and limestone sort of brought everything together. And it was, it went through, of course, multiple iterations of order and, through working with several different mentors. But yeah, that's what emerged.
I laugh because when you say obsessions and then you say now I call them motifs, I think it's okay to call them obsessions, because they're curiosities or questions. I had a manuscript and I sent it to Frontenac because I really loved Lisa Richter's book, Nautilus and Bone. I was really impressed by the content of her book and the beauty of her book. And so I thought this would be a great press. And I also knew that Micheline Mailer-Kovitz was the editor, one of the editors out there, and I wanted to work with Micheline. I learned so much with working with really good editors so far in my career as a poet. So she saw the manuscript and I thought it was well ordered. You know, I had put it out on the living room floor and organized it one night. I thought it was great. And she said, there needs to be more structure. And she said, do you not see it's a bit of a water world? And I said, no, but my previous book was called These Wings and it was all birds. So it was a flight book. Once I started to see that, she said, do you realize there's lots of elemental elements in your piece, the 4 elements, and that you could be looking at the meditative wheel, the Celtic wheel, to think about that. And I had been reading a lot of John O'Donohue and his work. And he has a book called The 4 Elements, and Sharon Blackie's work and Robert McFarlane's work. So all of this great sort of mythic stuff. And then that sort of became the Imram motif or obsession, the journey to some sort of mythic world in Irish lore. And the Morrigan, I'm fascinated by the character of the Morrigan. So she's a shapeshifter, and I thought this would work for a midlife, not a crisis, a midlife evolution moment for me as a woman and a poet.
I'm actually surprised that that elemental structure emerged in the edits because it feels so integral to the book. I'm like,
Yes.
I would have assumed that it was right there in the manuscript that you sent in.
It was there, but I couldn't see it. That's where I think the work of a poetry editor is so key to how a structure of the book changes, you know?
Frances, you said some of the poems are sort of very close to the bone when it comes to family and things like that. And then you said, so you decided to filter them through deep time. Both of these books have some really personal elements. And I'm always curious, like, how do you make the call? Right? Like, when are you like, you know, maybe I wrote this poem for me and it's just going to go in a drawer and not in a book?
I have poems that are definitely going to stay in a drawer, and some of these. The poem I read, Camel Hair Coat, it was published in Blackbird, the American online magazine, and the first line where I now said, my child who for so long resented me, I think when it was published said, still resents me. And things had changed. So, you know, and it made it more palatable to put it into the book to reflect a change in relationships. So that was, that was one thing. And apart from my poor children who appear in the book, the other family members are not around anymore. So I feel relatively comfortable putting them in.
That's a tough question when you think about what's private and what's public and what's a persona poem and what's really you. My new chapbook's very, very personal. It feels like almost too raw.
Right.
And so when I read that out loud, it's really hard to read from because it's sort of a difficult relationship that went awry with someone really dear. So that's hard. And I think, oh, why did I say yes to having Ian's Press publish it, Emergency Flash Mob, and but they're really good poems, and they show an evolution in my life as a poet and a person. So I think there's something to be said for that. There's a place for poems, and poets are most vulnerable, I think. Novelists can hide, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, there is the assumption that the persona is the poet, and that you want to not allow that assumption to remain always or even ever. Just, but yeah, it's something that you always have to think about and tread the line carefully.
Okay, thanks. Kim, you said the poems in that book are water poems.
Yes.
And they go through like the 4 elements, 5
Yeah.
if you count spirit, but after reading it, I'm like, yes, of course they're water poems. It felt like that the whole way through. And Frances, you've also got a bunch of water running through your book. And I personally am fascinated by the relationship between water and writing. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that as a theme.
Why don't you go, because you're the water lady.
What's it like to write about that? How do you think about writing water poems?
I love to swim.
Yeah.
So I swim often in the summer up north. We have lots of lakes, so I swim quite often. It's when I feel most free. I said to someone the other day, it feels like I'm flying, and they said, well, don't you just feel like a fish? And I said, well, I imagine a bird must feel like that when it's flying through air for that. For me, swimming does that. So I've grown up around lakes and water, and I think they're sort of gestational, really, you know. They're rife with bodies of water, rife with poetic symbolism and metaphor. I think poets sort of go towards birds, water. For me, as a Northern Ontario writer, I'm in the midst of elements all the time. Just get in the car and go hiking a half hour outside of town, and it's beautiful wilderness, protected. So it's part of what I write and what I've always written. Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, I didn't really notice that I was writing so many water poems, but it does feel, sort of as an element. I like to swim as well, although I don't have the opportunity to do it as much as Kim does, and have the same feeling of flying. But it's also, the myths around water, the Selkies and water sprites and the cauldrons that we've got with a couple of poems to some very old, both Welsh and Irish myths that draw on the water spirits. So it is there, and in fact, the work I'm currently, the new project I'm working on, for the first time, I'm sort of working towards a consistent theme rather than just gathering my poems, and it's the working title is Meniscus Blister, so that little bubble that appears on a glass of water, and it's looking at water and family and mental illness and just sort of things that I've touched on in other books, but trying to be a bit more deliberate about it. So it is a very strong impulse towards water.
Fascinating. Kim, a couple times now you said you're like a Sudbury writer, a Northern writer. Frances, your poems are linked to different places, but it's almost like you see the poem in the page, there's the title and then the poem, and then off to the right-hand side. Can you maybe show people?
Yeah, there's
often a little italic,
a little subtitle or tag or something.
Yeah. And they're not always geographical in nature, but they often are. So it's like you're linking poems to place.
Yeah, and that was something that came about in the editing process. I too submitted to Front and Hack House because I'd liked the work that they'd done before, and I did not work with Michelin Naylor. I worked with John Wall-Barger, who's another fabulous editor who's come on more recently than Michelin. And I'll talk a bit more about sort of the iteration from one mentor to another, or one editor to another. But John wanted the poems grounded. He thought that a lot of them were way too ethereal, and sort of some of them I was able to sort of ground in the poems themselves. But others I came up with the idea of putting these little tags on them that would be just sort of a little burst of location often, but there's ones that some say Ring of Kerry, some say Jazz Age, some say Salmon Moon. So it's something that if the poem was needed to be grounded, that's where I'd put it. Yeah.
Okay, and it's important to have them grounded for you.
I saw my editor's point. But I had, as I mentioned before, I worked with two mentors fairly extensively on this. I worked with Susan Gillis, and she, as we were working, was, encouraging me to go deeper in a lot of poems, which I did, and ended up writing some new poems derived from the initial ones. But she said when I told her that John would like to see them a bit more grounded, she says, "But I was trying to make them airier." So it was a bit of a dynamic push and pull between two very good, very strong editors, and I think the balance, hopefully ended up kind of nicely in the middle.
Interesting. Kind of the same question for you about poetry in place. Like a lot of these are. You said you're a Sudbury poet, a Northern Ontario poet, but these are poems sometimes grounded in Ireland, sometimes in Newfoundland. How does that work?
I don't know, I love to travel, and I feel like when I travel, I can sort of explore and I find new imagery. So rather than get stuck in the same image and write the same book over and over again, you don't want to be writing 5 books of the same poems. And just sort of, I'm really fascinated by myth. So a lot of these places that I'm really writing about, like Ireland and Newfoundland, are very closely tied. And I also write a lot about women artists. So I have a whole bunch of Pratt poems in mine as well. And I think just interested in how these women are part of landscapes that are, they are mythic themselves to me in terms of how they make themselves over and over in the way they create art. Like even Maud Lewis is interesting to me, so.
I mean, just perfect dovetail into a question about ekphrastic poetry, because both of you have poems about Mary Pratt, although that's not the only painter that appears in these. So, and you gave a workshop on this yesterday. How do you think about that? Like, what do you think of the relationship of the poem to the painting is? Are you using it as a source of inspiration? What responsibility to the painting do you feel when you're doing ekphrastic poetry?
Do we have an hour?
It's like a whole book right there, isn't it?
We've got about half of that.
Yeah, I mean, I see it as, often a conversation.
Yeah,
Right? You want to, sort of not be giving a verbal retelling of the painting or the film or the piece of music or whatever. So it's sort of various ways, obviously, into ekphrastic poetry. You can have description and reaction, or you can inhabit the poem. But so it really depends on the original source. If the way the artwork strikes me is what may radically vary how I respond to it.
For me, when I was traveling, I would always want to go to art galleries. So I would just sort of find these exhibits. So when I was traveling in Hawaii with a school group one year, there was an exhibit of Georgia O'Keeffe's Hawaii paintings. And I thought, what? Yeah. And she did posters for the Dole Pineapple Company. And then I started researching about her life and how she moved between Hawaii and New York and then New Mexico. And I thought, this woman is fascinating. So for me, it's more, I kind of just see an exhibit and then go into the person. And also, I was just always so bad at art in high school. And I really, really wanted to be an artist. So I loved being in art galleries. And now just being able to engage with visual art through writing is, I feel as if I'm almost there as an artist, but I'm not.
Reaching towards it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. Change gears a little bit. Both of you work in different genres. So both of you are prose writers as well as poets. And I guess the first question is, well, 2 related questions. One, what's the difference for you? And then 2, how do you know something's a poem as opposed to a story? Because Frances, you read Camel Hair Coat, which it's a wonderful poem. It could really easily be a short story. Like it tracks to me in some ways like that. And Kim, you open that collection with, you open the book with a sequence that is very narrative.
Yes.
It's a poem, and again, it works as a poem, but yeah, how do you draw that distinction? What's the difference for you in those 2 genres?
Poetry, I mean, yes, I do have a reasonable amount of narrative poetry, but poetry for me most often begins in trying to put the conscious brain aside, and I free write until I hit something that sticks, and very often it'll sit in my I have the Lee Valley thick books that I've got a whole stack of, and so the free writes will sit there for quite some time before I go back and look for something that resonates, that looks like it actually has the beginning of a poem to it. So it's really an intuitive feeling towards a poem, whereas with fiction, I almost always have an idea of a character or a situation and generally know where it's going to end. Okay. I don't always know the path it's going to take, but but I'll be working towards that ending and there'll be free writing along the way, of course, but the shape of the story, or my novella began as linked short stories and morphed into a novella, and my novel I did a seat of the pants draft in 12 weeks, and then worked on it. But it was I knew where it was going, and I think that's the biggest difference for me between. But that said, I do have one of the poems in here, one of the narrative poems in here, didn't feel like I'd gotten to the end of the story, and I saw an ending to it, and so I'm now trying to create that story as a story.
Okay.
That's a really good question. That one is the Tiny Songs for the Woman Who Watches Icebergs, and that's published in Thames Review, which I was so pleased to have that published because it's really kind of lovely and narrative and lyrical. So I wanted it to have the lovely echoes that it has, and it's like ripples through the entire structure in the style that I've written it. But when I'm thinking of my novel next year, that's a story around family in a mining town. It's called The Donahue Girl, and so it's based on a family story. But then even with my plays, they're people and characters, whereas my poems don't have that as much.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Interesting. All right. I told you I was going to ask this question before, but I'm always interested in like how a poem changes over its process, and what the differences are between where you started and the final published version. So I was going to ask you both to like pick something small and like read it, and maybe talk about where it started and how it ended up where it ended up.
Do you want to go, or do you? Yeah.
I have this little poem. It's called Hollow. A stitch in rhyme keeps time. Tangled web deceives. A nose knows roses. Wastrels want not. Ambient sound, rasp on wood. Sip-a-zibba, sup. Self-satisfied, a memory flake. Follow the cookie crumb trail. So that's now 5 lines. That was a probably 25 or 28 line poem to start with.
Right.
And I ended up just, I think this is one that I worked with John on rather than Susan, and kept saying, where is the heart of the poem? Where's the core of it? And I think that those lines were probably spaced out between other lines, but I condensed it down to this just little, it was about rhyme, about wordplay, and so I put it down to what felt like the core of the wordplay and the rhythm and the sound. So that's one.
Okay, well, thank you.
Do you miss the longer version?
The longer version is still on my computer.
Yeah. See? And it's got its own life, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's how I feel too. I have a tiny one at the very beginning, and it's called The Sea Inside. And I wrote it on my cell phone on the notepad thing when I was taking a trip out towards on Bonavista, the peninsula in Newfoundland. So I had written, this is the original one. It was, when there's a sea inside, even a drive out towards Little Heart's Ease won't make longing less of a sea and more of a pond. And Micheline said to me, there's something missing. And it's the first poem in the collection, so it has to sort of encompass what might come. So I added a few lines, and it reads now, when there's a sea inside, cockles and mussels, alive, oh, oysters, urchins, and the sulky soul of a woman dressed in night-dirge black, even a drive out towards Little Heart's Ease won't make longing less of a sea and more of a pond. Changes it totally.
Changes, that middle part just resonates. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I kind of stole something from that old song.
Yeah. So one of them got added to, and the other got cut dramatically down. And the final versions are wonderful. There's Selkies in that, and like there's a reasonable amount of Ireland in both of these books. Can you talk about that? The relationship to it, how you draw on it?
Yeah, I mean, I've only made one trip to Ireland. It's my heritage on both sides of the family, and but several generations on, both in both of my parents' case. But and I remember my father talking about his father, who was a grand marshal in the St. Patrick's Day parade in Montreal, because he was a police officer and was the only one with an access to a horse. And I also, sort of had some other family stories about how he left the family at one point and shipped out to Ireland and came back and said not a word about it. So there's these kind of resonances of history there, but history and mystery. Yeah. So, the one trip we took was with our adult daughters, and it was kind of a whirlwind circle tour. So my knowledge of Ireland comes, just sort of that mystery and the brief tourist is informed by the reading I've done of Irish poets and Irish fiction writers, and I'm on a Donald Ryan binge right now. I'm reading through his entire work and just read Elaine Feeney's How to Build a Boat, which is absolutely wonderful. So I think it's more sort of like a yearning that I'm filling with literature, and an absence in the family stories that I'm filling with literature and with imagining and reading the myths and feeling the myths, and getting to something that feels interior through the stories.
My father was German, of German descent, and his mother was Irish and Scottish and English, but my mother's side was pure Irish. And so my grandfather on my dad's side was not very kind to us as children. So that side of my family did not really raise us in terms of imagination, I guess, and creativity. But I had 3 great aunts and a grandmother who were telling me stories as I was growing up about the lore and everything else. And it was just part of every event we ever had. They were always singing Irish songs. I had an aunt who used to sing under the table at Christmas. She would drink Tullamore Dew and get a little bit, off kilter, and then sing All Glory and Hail to St. Patrick under the table, literally. So I just started reading a lot of Irish poetry. I fell into Yeats and all of his wonderful work about fairies. And then from there, I got into Seamus Heaney's work, and I did my master's thesis on Heaney. So, and then I just started traveling to Ireland to write. So I've been quite a few times. And I think it's just that it's the veil between the two worlds. It's so thin and so wonderful if you're a poet. It's seductive to me.
You've already mentioned a number of authors, but what are the kind of people who influence these books? Because both of them are, we've talked about the ekphrastic poetry in them, and they're very much in communication with art, they're in communication with myth and legends, but also an interesting array of other writers.
Oh gosh, my mind always goes blank when I'm asked to talk about influences and who I've drawn on. You want to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I love Mary Oliver. I think just because she's that pastoral tradition sort of, and really evocative to me in terms of how she views the elements and the land and the natural world with spirit, not in a religious way really, but in a spirited way. And I'm keen on Yeats, a lot of the Irish poets, for what they do with wordplay, but especially Seamus Heaney. He was like my sort of guiding star. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think about people who've been, who I've had the pleasure of and the privilege of working with. So Barry Dempster and Don Mackay, and Susan Gillis. They're reading them and working with them sort of imbued me, I think, a bit with a bit of the same similar sensibility, but not in any kind of imitative way, because who could imitate those writers, right? But yeah, sort of the reading and the mentoring kind of filters in somehow, I think.
Yeah, interesting. Another thing the books have in common is an interest in women's stories. You talked about, Frances, a number of the poems are focused on the work women do with their hands. When you write about artists, it's not always, but it tends to be women artists. Can you talk a little bit about that, and about that subject matter and your relationship to it?
Well, just, sort of always looking at women's lives. And, one of the ekphrastic poems here is based on a Prudence Heward painting, Girl on a Hill. And she was part of an exhibit that was was at several of the galleries. I saw it in Vancouver and again in National Gallery in Ottawa, called Uninvited. Women who should be part of, women artists who should be part of the canon. And some of them, like Heward, are in the National Gallery, but there's others who had tremendous talent, but were stifled by circumstances of some sort or other. So sort of in the terms of the women artists, that sort of notion is there. That's like it's our turn, and women, talking about open work, things like filigree and embroidery, which are labeled craft and not art, and bringing that more to the fore, and seeing the value in the work that is done communally often by women, and the knit and bitch is the latest iteration of that. But just thinking about what women in community do, women as artists, and the day-to-day work that results in fabric or in beautiful things. And so that's I think that's where I wanted to make the open work really prominent in the title, and picked poems that had that in a variety of ways.
Is that in part where your interest in Mary Pratt's paintings come from?
Oh yeah, I mean, she's very much about the domestic, right? The kitchen sink, and all that goes with it. So yeah, no, I remember first seeing Mary Pratt probably in a book before I saw it in real life, and just like, yeah, you can paint about that.
I'm interested in the couples, I think, because there are artistic pairings, and usually the women sort of are eclipsed by the men, but then sort of go above the men later. So with Frida and Diego, obviously, he was not a nice man. And then with Maud and Everett was not a nice man. Christopher Pratt and Mary, I mean, he eclipsed her at first, and then she eclipsed him, but after she had done all the domestic stuff. So the feminism piece is interesting to me. Georgia O'Keeffe and Stieglitz, I mean, that's another weird one, right? So I'm interested in how women's voices even were heard at that point in time in history through all of those various couples. But that's what I think I'm interested in, is like how they've managed to be heard. And I keep thinking, what would they be like now if they were of this time period? That they probably wouldn't have been with those sorts of partners, maybe. They may have just eclipsed everyone regardless of the pairing, So I'm fascinated by that.
Interesting. Change directions again. It's a question about process. How do you actually go about writing? Like a really granular way. When you sit down to make poems, Frances, you already talked about a lot of free writing.
Yeah.
But like, when you're sitting down to do something like you just talked about, in some ways giving voice to someone from the past, how do you go about doing that? How do you turn that into poetry?
Yeah. You probably have a process.
I just get a line, honestly, from whenever I write something, it doesn't matter what genre, it sounds weird. And some of my students always say, is it like you're possessed? And I always say, no, it's not like that. But then you try to explain how you write creatively to someone who's not a creative writer, and they think you're bonkers. So that's why I hang out with poets and artists, because that's where I feel most comfortable. I think I just get a line or an image in my head, and I have to write it down. If I don't write it down, it disappears.
Okay.
So I start there and I draft, and then I leave it and I go back to it. I've learned so much from editing poetry from people. So like Ken Babstock, you were saying the mentoring piece. I worked with Ken Babstock as a mentor at Sage Hill for poetry, and Monica Kidd for poetry and editing, and Micheline. So that sort of process is really key to how you learn to sort of not be precious with your work and think, oh, it's lovely, I'll just leave it like that.
And I'm going to assume that, and just based on the part of the poem that you read when I asked you about sort of the process, you do or are open to and do see things change fairly substantially working with an editor?
I think so, because they will see things that you can't see or too close to anything, whether it's a novel that you're working on or short fiction or creative nonfiction, doesn't really, or even working with a dramaturg. They're there to ask you questions about why you're crafting your piece, no matter what the genre is, and how you've chosen to craft it that way. And they'll ask you a question, well, why? What is missing here is detail and sharp language and imagery for that particular poem. But in other ways, you have to be thinking, well, why did I do that? Because nothing in poetry is arbitrary, right? So if you can't answer their questions, then you have to look to yourself and think, this needs revision to make it stronger.
Yeah.
It might be difficult to answer the why when the lines just come to you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's true too. There's that weird part, but there's always crafting involved in the revision process. So the weird part happens first, and then the revision later. Yeah.
Yes. So for me, as I said, I tend to write reams. I write these, the free write, and then when I go to revisit it, it's sort of it is a paring down. It is looking for very often for like when I free write, it'll be sound that drives my hand, because I try and write without stopping, and so I get some kind of riffs of sound. And here's the wonderful sound poet, Ben Kemp, right here in front of us. But that's I don't do the marvelous things that she does, but I'm always trying to attune my ear to sound as I take the reams of writing and see where it becomes a poem. And I like very much to think about the shape of a poem on a page as I write. So line breaks and stanza breaks will also dictate how I end up editing it and moving things around. And gosh, I want this to be 5 lines, but I've got an extra 2 phrases in here that I like, but I'm going to take them out because I want the shape of the poem to be the way I've decided it wants to be.
When do you make that decision? Because you've got a lot of different forms in this book. You've got sort of pre-conventional, I guess, open form poetry, starts the left-hand margin kind of stuff, but you've also got prose poetry and some other different things.
Yeah,
when in the process does that decision get made? Because you just said, you like to sort of make it fit the form that you've decided on.
Yeah, or the form that comes to me as something to do. I very often, as I'm free writing, I'm not writing in lines. I'm writing in prose effectively. And if I type it up and it feels like it's prose, feels like it wants to stay as a paragraph, then very often it does. But other times I have a wonderful writers group that I meet with in Ottawa. We've been meeting 17 years now, every week. Not everybody makes it every week, but we've been, and so they're my first my first readers on my 20th draft or whatever it might be. But so getting their feedback and their takes on it, that if they've completely missed the point of what I thought I was saying, or sometimes I'm going like, does this mean that so-and-so, such and such happened? And I'm like, could be. Yeah, maybe I'll go with that. And sort of try and put sometimes a bit more concreteness to it. But yeah, working with an editor is remarkable. And in terms of fiction, I just want to shout out to my story that was in Thames Review, that Amy Mitchell did an amazing job pushing me to get the story to be, like I very rarely write political stuff, and this was my most political story that I had really hoped to have out in the world before it came out in my book. And so I was so grateful for the work that she did on it, and I'm really happy with the story as it turned out. So editing is magic.
Editing, and it seems like that writers group that you work with is pretty important as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. And it's community, of course. So.
Okay, I think we're starting to come to the end of this, so I've got a few more questions, but first I want to ask the audience if anyone has any questions.
Just a connection. Would you connect the open porous? Would you connect Would you connect the open porous nature of limestone to the open porous nature of the open work of craft women? Did you in the book? I haven't read
Could
it
be.
Yet. You will now?
Will now. Yes, thank you, Ben.
I would love to hear Celtic
think we can, because I've got 2 more questions, then I was going to ask you to round this off by reading us at least one more.
David
poem.
had a question.
Do you have a question? Yeah. So,
I found it really interesting throughout this conversation. A few times there was the reference to the drawer poems, right? The poems that sort of go in the drawer, and then also the alternate versions of poems that have a life beyond the book, or continue to exist in some capacity. And what I was wondering is, are there any projects or pieces that you have in the drawer or that currently have a life on your computer that you're really interested in revisiting, and maybe they haven't found a home yet, but you'd like them to have a home at some point?
There are always poems. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's always poems that you try to work on strengthening and submit to journals, and they get rejected all the time, and then you try to think, well, what have I done? Is there something wrong with the poem? And then you might send it somewhere else and someone else likes it. So I just always keep those ones in the drawer and know that I'm going to revisit them and not put them away in a locked box, that drawer is always open, possibly, to revision, and then maybe making it into a different collection. There were some pieces that I thought initially would be in this collection, which will be in my next collection. So, and they're more eco-poetry. It didn't fit this one, it will fit the next manuscript.
Yeah, similarly for me, I have some of the water poems are going to go in the meniscus blister, and move forward with that. And I still, I keep everything. I have a novel, to use the term loosely, that I wrote in the 3-day novel writing contest in 1980, I think. Oh, wow. That hopefully will never see the light of day, but it's in the drawer. It's in the drawer. So.
all right. Well, yeah. You've been touring these books for a little while,
yeah.
Correct? So my last question is just, what had you hoped to be asked over the course of these kinds of talks that no one's actually asked you? Yeah. Like, is there something that you were like, I wish I would have had a chance to talk about this, and you haven't yet?
You've done more panels.
I've done more panels. No, I mean, the question you asked about revision was the first question I've ever had about revision. So that's probably the thing I would answer you with, was that's really interesting to me, because I'm interested in craft, right? Yeah. So with each revision, it should be playing with craft and then seeing what works better, or which is stronger for what it's calling for. So your question, actually, thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I share your interest in craft. So
yeah.
And for me, this is the first time I've been on a panel. I've been doing readings, and with a few questions from the audience. But this is the first time I've.
Well, then what didn't I ask you about?
I guess nothing that leaps out. I maybe just sort of what the appeal of deep time is, but I kind of think I've answered that. Deep time and myth linking to family. But.
Okay. All right. Well, then, could you finish off this panel by sharing at least another poem with us?
I don't have a Selkie poem, but I have an Alwyn poem. Would that do?
Or Mary Pratt, I think, was part of it.
I only have the one Mary Pratt.
You go ahead.
Okay. So this is evoking Alwyn. And this is one poem that's very much spread out on the page. Thanks to John Walbarger, I think, wanted me to have more space in the poem. Why do you want to know, my child responds to the question I've posed. For me, a stammering, mumbled reply, no easy way to translate, a rapture, a breeze, to put words to the flow of essence the bards knew as Alwyn. The stream is anything but shallow. It is deep, muddy, anything but clear. A current churns strong below the unruffled surface. Eager inquiries like wolfsbane repel the wildling I yearn to run with. Forget eureka, lightning strikes, what I stumble over, eyes on ground, that bit of grass. Word seeds, invisible among a tangle of weeds. Drops from a long simmering cauldron. Salmon flesh splattering as it cooks over an open flame. My burnt thumb, tongue-soothed, douse deeper, a fresh spring. a smear of honey, sugary milk on my mouth.
That's beautiful. I love the word seeds. I want to steal that, but I
Steal
won't.
away.
I know. My Selkie poems are really long, and they sort of bookend the book. There's a Selkie and a sailor sort of all the way through, if you look at the beginning and end of the book. But I'll read you one of the Pratt ones, maybe. And this is when I heard she had died. It really upset me. It's a book. It's poem 9 in Still Life, a series of Mary Pratt poems. Ebb and flow like the ocean. You were the boat, painted white, tied to the wharf, but tidal in longing. From dawn to dusk, under moon or sky, shadows defined the edges, ran fingers down along the curves, elusive sometimes. Above the water, some seabirds hover, the ghost of an iceberg out beyond harbor mouth, its frozen life shaded in, then out. Now, months later, a still life study in the kitchen, blue mixing bowl, sun shining onto silver of sink, flour tossed onto counter, light with bread still rising.
Wonderful. Thank you. This brings us to a close. I'd like to thank both Kim.
One sec. We got a couple of questions.
Oh, we got
on the
questions for
webinar.
me? All right,
Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have a question from Nancy. Nancy wants to know how you have found your poetry mentors, and can you talk about the process of working with a mentor?
I'll go. I've worked, Sage Hill and Banff have been huge. I've been to Sage Hill 3 times, and when I was before I left Saskatchewan, the last thing I did was go to the predecessor to Sage Hill, to Saskatchewan Summer School of the Arts. So I worked with Don Mackay and Barry Dempster and Stan Dragland and Beth Follett, all in, sort of in a workshopping setting. And the Banff program that no longer exists, unfortunately, the wired writing, was 2 weeks in residence followed by 6 months online with Barry Dempster, and that was great. And the editors, John Walbarger and Micheline Mailer were editors for the press, so that their input was at the behest of the press.
I make my holidays writing retreats. So I teach high school, and in the summer I try to find places where I can go to learn more to make my poetry stronger. So one summer, for instance, I went to Ireland to work with Susan Rich, who's an ekphrastic poet from Seattle. Another summer I went to Scotland to work with John Glenday and Jen Hadfield, who are really amazing. Scottish poet John Glenday and the Shetlands, Jen Hadfield. So I look for places where I know I'm going to have a poet that I love their work and that they're going to teach me to be a stronger poet. Also, Banff and Sage Hill, beyond a doubt, is a great place too.
Terrific. We also have a question from one of the people who joined your poetry workshop yesterday, who's joining from home here, Jennifer Wen. Jennifer wants to know, Jennifer remarks that they also write ekphrastic poetry, but will sometimes find stimulation and creativity from visual art, whether or not they're writing directly about that piece of visual art that they're reflecting on. Do you have that experience, that visual art, whether or not it's a direct influence for the poem, but it stimulates further creativity?
I think if you're surrounding yourself with art, I think most writers do gravitate towards listening to live music, going to art galleries, going to theater. I don't know. I know a lot of writers who, sort of submerge themselves in the artistic way of life, and I think that definitely makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think if it's in the air, if it's in the surroundings. I've got a bulletin board next to my computer with postcards and little bits and pieces that I will look up at occasionally. And of course, I don't listen to music while I write. I have not found the playlist that works for me yet. But outside of writing, being in an environment of theater or music or whatever, it's almost, it's fuel.
I listen to Jeremy Dutcher when I'm writing, And Glenn Gould a lot. I have a Glenn Gould problem, I admit it. And also Thomas Tallis, so the 40-part motet. I love that piece. So.
Any more questions? We're good? All right, I think that then this does officially bring us to an end. I'd like to thank everyone watching online for the questions and for coming online, everyone who came in person, and Frances and Kim. Can we give them a round of applause?